We're live. Hello, everybody. How's everyone doing? I am excited to have you all for our latest workshop on the state of the labor markets, especially from a talent acquisition perspective. I'm going to give it a minute or so while people continue to sign in. Um, and while we do that, I'd love for you all to write in on the chat and tell us where you're joining us from. I'm based here in frigid New York City. Kelsey, where are you?
I'm in equally frigid San Diego, California.
What? It's not
Not
frigid in San Diego.
it's frigid for us, but I will say our of course our temperatures are still in double digits, so I won't harp too much on that.
Well, we've got people in Montreal, in North Carolina, in Baltimore, California. So you're, and so we're going to start. We're going to get started today, and get going while we record all this. We have quite a few people in New York. New York represent. Hello. Um, my name's Amit Bhatia. I'm the co-founder and CEO of Data People, and I am a data nerd. I love thinking about data that we have and what's happening in the market. And I today we do these workshops every month. We did one a few weeks ago about job board optimization. We're going to do one on data-driven hiring in a few weeks. And I'm joined today with an incredible person that I'm really excited to have on, Kelsey, who is our product manager for our data pipelines and specifically spends a lot of time thinking about labor market insights. Kelsey, thanks for being here.
Pleasure to be here. Thanks, Amit.
You've been thinking about labor market data, and you're also a Taekwondo instructor. So tell me, like, how do you make that all those connections happen, all those interests come together?
Yeah, so I think for the longest time I'm very interested in human psychology, but I also realized quickly that the data behind our behavior really matters, and we can learn a lot from those trends. But we also have to remember the human element in all of those statistics as well. So I'm really interested in that nexus between those two fields.
That's fantastic. I'm excited too, because that's exactly what we do. If for those who are, I think we have a lot of customers on, we have a lot of familiar faces in the chat. But for those of you who don't know us, Data People is a platform for data-driven hiring and increasing productivity. We do two things. We help you turn your job descriptions into incredible ads, and we help you drive an analytical and data-driven talent acquisition process. So I'm loving, and today we're going to show you parts of how you can use our product along the way, but it really is going to be about the data. So I'm excited to see you all and show you. And what we want to cover today is unpacking both the market signals and our data on what is happening in these crazy talent markets. We're going to get into what's happening across different role types, what's happening in locations. But because we're coming at this from the perspective of talent acquisition. We're not labor economists. I don't think anybody who signed up is a labor economist. And if you are, hello. Our focus is going to be, how do you build a strategy around this? How do talent acquisition leaders and professionals do capacity planning, do strategic planning, start to understand how do we react to the market in a world where you're getting maybe hundreds of unqualified apps for some of your roles and no apps for some of the other roles, in a world where so much change is happening, RTO, global hiring, distributed hiring, pay transparency, compliance. How can you get better? And that's going to be our focus today. So keep the questions coming in, keep the observations coming in. And from our last workshops, we found that our audience often has some of the best ideas, some of the best tips. You're all practitioners, you're people on the ground who are actually doing incredible work. So don't be shy, share it with everybody else. Let's all learn from you as well. And remember, Erin, thank you, Erin, for making the point. Remember to set your chat to everyone so we all get to see it, not just the hosts and panelists, which is the default setting. So I'm going to get into it. This is one of the most confusing labor markets in history. So confusing. In the past, labor markets are either talent friendly, like candidate friendly, like imagine 2021, the period we just went through, where it was really easy to get hired and really hard to hire in most sectors. Or the markets are really, employer friendly. Think 2008, where it was easy to hire, but really hard to get hired. And typically recessions are like that. This is one of the few labor markets in history that I can remember where it is simultaneously really, really hard to get hired and really hard to hire. And that is confusing. It's weird. And I'm sure you're dealing with it. I'm kind of curious if you are, and please write in if you are. How do you deal with it? How do you make sense of it? In fact, if you look at even the headlines, it's so confusing. Like 2 weeks ago, our headlines about job seekers have been looking for jobs for 6 months, and I think if you're on LinkedIn, you see that's in your face. It's up front. But you're also seeing then right after that, about 10 days ago, the strongest labor job report drop. We had, in November, we had sort of all these articles about the white collar recession, how hard it is. And then we're also sort of having constant sort of articles about how much of a labor shortage we have and how hard it is to hire in some roles. And we see that in our data too. When in some sectors, it's impossible to get candidates. And in some sectors, there's just such a flood. Even CEOs are kind of finding this economy confusing, and maybe that's not a surprise. You have CEOs who say in September they said we're going to do a hiring pullback, and now in December they're like, actually, 2025 is going to be we're going to do more hiring than ever. So I don't speak for all CEOs, but I'd say we don't have any better forecasting than anybody else. Actually, this group probably has the best forecasting. You live it, you see the pipeline, you see the data. And so today we wanted to take more of one of the problems with simply looking at labor market data is it's often lagging. And we wanted to look at it from a perspective of what is the current application volumes, what do the application trends tell us for the future? I'm going to pause and ask you all a question. Do you disagree with CEOs? So what do you think is going to happen in 2025? Are we going to see increased hiring or decreased hiring? Please write into the chat. Kelsey, what do you think? Where's your finger on this pulse?
I don't want to spoil any of our later chat, but I think my quick take is that these conflicting feelings are warranted. There is kind of, it depends a little bit where you're sitting on the market and in what industry. So it looks like we've got some people more leaning towards the increase in early careers hiring.
I like Robert's comment, and it's very specific, increase in early careers hiring. And boy, do we need that, especially when you look at some of the employment rates coming out of a lot of the admissions, a lot of the colleges and postgraduate institutions. We definitely need a better early careers framework. So Kelsey, your bet's on it getting slightly better for the job market getting slightly stronger?
I'm going to say overall stronger, but it might depend a little bit where you're sitting at the table.
I think that's right. I think one thing that's also massively changed is geography. We are in such a dramatically distributed world that it's often hard to predict, that it's not as correlated, and it's weird in different ways. We'll talk a little bit about that as we go. So I'm going to hand it to you, Kelsey. Walk us through the data.
Yes. So if we can go ahead to the next slide. Awesome. So we really wanted to take a look at how can we quantify some of these feelings and some of these stories that we're seeing circulate, some of these articles. So we've already kind of mentioned a few of the common metrics like job openings and unemployment rates, but in order to understand the relationship of those two metrics together, today we're going to look at the ratio of job seekers to job vacancies according to official government data. This ratio is really helpful because it is indicative of how many job seekers are competing for each open position. So a lower ratio, something below 1, is going to mean that there are fewer job seekers per vacancy, and this would indicate a tighter labor market. On the flip side, a high ratio, or something above 1, is going to signify that there are more job seekers than available positions, which suggests a more competitive job market with more people vying for fewer jobs. We're also going to be sharing some candidate pool data, which is going to be the median applicant pool per job requisition. When this number is small, it's going to indicate that there are fewer job seekers applying to each job, and a larger median is going to be indicative of jobs that have a lot of seeker activity on that post.
So let's get into it.
Let's get into it. So according to government data, over the past 2 years, there has been some relaxation across the major markets. Globally, we saw that the US observed a relatively tight labor market, while UK, Australia, and the EU saw varying degrees of more competitive job markets. In the US, there are more vacant jobs than active job seekers. And in the UK, Australia, and EU, the trends have been opposite, meaning that there is more active job seekers than available positions. So whether the countries have been generally experiencing a tight or a loose labor market, that's what those arrows are going to indicate to you. The general trend is a gradual relaxation. And this kind of left us feeling like this is maybe just one piece of a more complicated puzzle.
So let's get into that complicated puzzle because I'm finding it really confusing because in some markets, and I think you see this here, like Europe says it's getting loose, but Germany is incredibly tight.
Right.
North America says it's tight, but Canada has gotten really loose very quickly from a labor market standpoint.
Exactly. So these unemployment rates or the job seeker vacancy ratios are great economic metrics, but it really speaks volumes, pun intended, when you look at actual candidate behavior. So most of these geographies did see those recent increases in median applications per job. We have between 2022 and 2024, there's nearly a twofold increase in the applicant pool sizes for all geographies, with the exception of Germany, which again tracks with, as you said, that data that we saw before, where Germany saw some growth in that time period, despite a slight decrease in 2023. Now, Canada saw an explosive growth between 2022 and 2023, and then a more moderate increase going into 2024. But overall, the median Canada pool size is approximately 40% larger in most geographies in 2024 versus previous years.
And I
So,
know
yeah,
40% doesn't seem that big, but it feels when you're a talent acquisition professional, feels like the inbound applicant volume is probably in some areas, it feels like, oh my God, it's gone massively big. So that's going to be
absolutely.
something we're going to unpack because, you know, it doesn't feel commiserate. I mean, US is still well below pre-pandemic levels of application volumes and of unemployment rates and of hiring volumes.
Right, exactly. And I mean, I keep coming back to that word doubled. That's double the amount of work, right? The double the amount of applications to process, double the amount of people to vet
Yeah.
and to go through. Um, so, I mean, put simply, over the last year, countries generally saw growth in candidate pools relative to their own previous year, but the median size of those pools themselves varied greatly by geography. And it echoes the story that we saw from the official government data as well. So we did have the opportunity to drill down a little bit farther with the EU job seeker to vacancy data. And I think it's really important to note that while the EU collectively presented that relaxed market, that's certainly not the experience for all of the members. We see here that countries like Germany, which we've mentioned in the previous slide as well, and the Netherlands had a much different experience over the last 2 years than some of their other EU counterparts. The Southern and Eastern Europe groups see an incredibly relaxed and essentially sustained labor market where there's like 4 to 6 job seekers for each job that they have posted, where this broad range in the ratios implies a very different job hunting experience as well as potential candidate experience, as we consider a ratio in one country compared to another on each side of the spectrum.
Yeah, one of the things that I sort of threw, it's when you think of like the blue, it feels like those are more relaxed markets. But even within the blues, you'll notice that each of these markets is actually a lot of them are getting really tight. So Slovakia, Poland, Croatia. What's happening is as the US market has been really tight and with increased rates, I think what we're starting to see is a lot of US companies aggressively hiring in Eastern Europe, opening up Eastern Europe geography. So we're starting to see sort of global trends take a perspective here. Robert's got a great question, which says, do you see trends where companies based in should invest in relocation benefits when budgeting for the job? Absolutely. And I think, Robert, we're already seeing that. We're seeing them open up hubs in those markets. And I think even within the US, especially as we're doing on-site roles, it is so much harder to hire in parts of the Midwest than it is to hire in some of the coastal cities. And so relocation benefits could be really a high ROI investment in order to get talent into the right places.
Great question. So now we're just going to take a pivot back to the US based jobs and dig a little deeper there too. On the left side here, we see through the government data that after several quarters of a trend suggesting a more relaxing market, at the end of 2024, we did see that slight tightening for the US. On the right, we can remember that we did say that we saw an increase in application volumes in 2024. So those two things side by side might feel like a slight contradiction, which suggested that there's fewer seekers per job for each post, at least at the end of the year. So to understand this relationship better, we really have to look at the context. We know that there's a number of factors that have impacted inbound pipelines and syndication of jobs. We've got one-click apply, salary transparency, changes to the algorithms, a fall in popularity amongst and development of key search engines. All of these changes have resulted in a substantial unpredictability of performance of jobs, but of course, we'd be remiss to not mention the changes in job site being remote, hybrid, and on-site roles, right? So,
Boy, so we're seeing remote go down a lot, but man,
oh yeah,
hybrid.
yes, this was fascinating to me to see this progression year over year. So when we dig into this job site breakdown, we do see that these categories have dramatically different behaviors. So just to give everybody context here, the remote roles are represented in that bright blue. Hybrid roles are in the teal color, and on-site roles are in yellow. So the remote jobs are waning in popularity amongst employers, with declines in proportion of US jobs since 2022. So we've seen this continuous decline in their proportion, right? And in contrast, those hybrid roles have been eating it up, increasing in popularity. We've seen a lot of those return to office mandates and increasing from representing just 4% of the US jobs in 2022 to more than 15% in 2024.
Now, is there an official definition of hybrid, Kelsey? It's a great question.
There is. There is. So this is based off of data people annotation. On-site is designated if there's no mention whatsoever of remote or hybrid in any component of the job. Remote is only assigned if it is explicit, if it's not explicitly hybrid. So if you have a post that mentions hybrid, it's going to, or some component, some type of geolocation in any way, then it's going to be categorized as hybrid.
But I think there's a broader question, which is in our market today, jobs are calling themselves hybrid, but there is a big variation between, is that 2 days a week, 3 days a week, 4 days a week in the office? What is the degree of flexibility? And Ro brings up a really good point. I've seen, she's seen job postings of hybrid work that require 4 days in the office. And at that point, you're like, is that even really hybrid, or is that just
Right.
some degree of flexibility as a perk?
That is a great point. Right.
And I
And
do think that that 15% hybrid number is probably understated, because there's a lot of companies, I don't think companies are still utilizing the hybrid tag or hybrid terminology really effectively. And I think there's a lot more flexibility that's baked into our system these days than before the pandemic.
absolutely, I would agree. And there isn't that universal definition yet, at least. And so that does leave a lot of room for candidate interpretation based off of how it might be written in a job description.
Hannah asked a really good question. So if a job is sort of specifies remote, but within New York City remote, is that remote? Is that hybrid? How do you think about that?
I would classify that as hybrid.
Yeah.
In that, again, you are requiring your candidate or your potential employee to be physically in a location of some kind.
Yeah. But I do think that if it's like all of United States, like I think companies have to specify sometimes like a country level specificity, and it's still remote, because that's more for work authorization, visa statuses, being
Yes.
tax implications. But if it is a city level location, it's probably more hybrid if you're tethering somebody.
Absolutely. And I think it again brings us back to the importance of clarity in those job descriptions, because if it's unclear for a candidate, they might not know whether or not they should be applying for that position.
That's right. So let's talk about, how do candidates perceive?
Yeah, so back to again, that psychology point, it's always a factor with these statistics, but unsurprisingly, the US remote jobs attract the largest candidate pools, with an average candidate pool size of 184 in 2024, which is up from 99 in 2022. So again, we see this nearly twofold difference in
Yeah.
applications. And in contrast, those on-site jobs attract the smallest candidate pools, averaging only 25 candidates in 2024, which is an increase from the 2 prior years. But again, like very clearly a totally different story from these two types of roles.
The one thing that surprised me when I looked at this data was we did this cut about a year ago when we did the distributed hiring report. And even a year ago, hybrid roles behaved a lot like on-site. Like the difference between the hybrid and on-site was statistically insignificant. Today, hybrid is starting to kind of move towards remote. Like as remote jobs are getting fewer and fewer and candidates want flexibility, there is sort of hybrid is becoming a category. But one thing that strikes me is we still do capacity planning within talent acquisition as a monolith. You're hiring 5 recs, but it's very clear 5 remote recs is different from 5 hybrid recs, is very different from 5 on-site recs. And so you've got to kind of completely think about recruiting in a very different way than you did pre-pandemic.
That's exactly it. And, we consider these candidate pool sizes in conjunction with the proportion of data that each job site represents. Like we're essentially saying that 70% of jobs or the on-site roles are starved for applicants, while 14% being the remote roles. And I would even wager to start lumping hybrid into that category as well, are becoming maybe oversaturated with candidates.
That's right.
So let's look at the US data again through another lens, being sectors. The government data shows us that there is distinct variation in the primary reporting sectors, where sectors like transportation, professional, health, and education are experiencing a continuously tight labor market, while you have construction, retail, and manufacturing jobs seeing a relatively more relaxed market.
And I find that so confusing because just the other day, there's the articles about how it's impossible to, there's a huge construction labor shortage. And I think professional, this is BLS terms, right? Professional says it's incredibly tight. And yet, everywhere we read about white collar recession and how hard it is for white collar professionals to find a job these days. So this is one of the big problems with the way the economists look at the world, is it feels like sometimes it's completely disconnected from the way candidates or employers look at the world.
Right. Well, and on top of that, right, we see a paradox in the trend where the overall aggregate is quite different than the trends that you see when you break out certain subgroups.
And so let's look at that. So this is our data around applicant volumes. What does it tell you? Professional has gotten a lot easier.
Yeah, I mean, so we do see that there's this average of 82 candidates per role in 2024 for professional roles, which is up again from the previous 2 years, quite significantly. And then in contrast, we see these frontline roles that are starved of candidates averaging a mere 6 to 8 candidates between 2022 and 2024. So, I mean, yeah, when we're talking about 6 candidates to 82, depending on that specific role type, that's a big difference.
It's massive. And how do you even like plan hiring when you have to deal with that?
Right. Which kind of creeps back to my comment earlier about it really depends what seat you're sitting in at the table. What exactly are you trying to hire for, and where are you trying to do it?
That's right. So let's unpack the professional piece.
Yes, we've
Is it
got
a
one more
monolith?
layer. One more layer for y'all. Not so much the monolith here. We're even within this professional category. So zooming in pretty far as cross sections go, we're still able to see some pretty significant differences even within this category. All three of these roles did see sustained increases between 2022 and 2024, but they did so at much different rates. G&A and tech roles saw a much larger growth in candidate pool size, effectively doubling between 2022 and 2024. Again, that twofold difference, which is just a shocking growth in just 2 years. While the GTM roles did see a more moderate, going from a median of 48 in 2022 to 70. But again, growth, but at very different rates.
And so, I think this answers part of Rose's question, which is in the tech industry, engineering roles are actually a lot easier to hire now than they have been. We're starting to see some normalization coming back. We're starting to see it get tighter again. But the go-to-market roles, hiring account executives, hiring people in marketing, demand gen, Those are hard roles to hire for. It continues to be hard roles to hire for. And there's still, only 40 to 50 applicants per role in a lot of those areas.
Absolutely. And I think through all of the breakdowns we've talked about today, we're just seeing that the current market is not a reflection of this one size fits all behavior. You'd spoken before about it being one side of the fence or the other in terms of either hard to hire or like employer friendly or candidate friendly, right? But that's just not what we're seeing right now. It's truly a synthesis of a variety of behaviors and trends based on multiple different factors and a really wide range from one side of the scale to the other.
That's
In
right.
stats, we would call this Simpson's paradox, where it's a statistical phenomenon where trends reverse or even disappear when we start to peel back those layers and get into the subgroups versus just an overall summary statistic. And
That's right.
something else to kind of think about that I've been toying with is, when we're looking at a simple seeker to vacancy ratio, an individual is counted one time in that calculation. But in reality, again, that human behavioral element, a single individual can apply to countless jobs, and there's a lot of mechanisms right now to do so at scale.
And I think that's really made capacity planning also so hard, right? You're getting so many different one-click applies and AI applications. And
Yes,
so, and the recruiting teams themselves have gotten so much smaller. So they've got to sort of grapple with a volume that they didn't ever capacity plan for.
exactly. It's not just what's available and who's looking for it. It's more dynamic than that. And those TA and recruiting teams have to somehow account for this influx.
That's right. So let's think about now talent acquisition roles. And I want to sort of jump into that. Like we're seeing two different stories, whether you're in the US or the EU. In the US, over the last few years, talent acquisition has gotten gutted. So we looked at like growth rate of talent acquisition to sort of see sustained areas. And what we saw was, the growth rate for talent acquisition jobs was fairly negative for now a while. But finally, in the last 3 quarters, we've started to see it go back into positive territory, just about break even, and start to see 2 quarters of sustained growth. That's really useful. That's really important. And I think because often hiring of talent acquisition is a leading indicator for hiring in general, and it starts to sort of portend where the labor market is likely going in the US. And so those signs point along with the other candidate volume signs that we are looking towards, the CEOs, or the most recent view of the CEOs, and I think the view of the group here, that I think we are sort of cautiously optimistic about the hiring market getting tighter is true in the US. But in the EU, it's a very different story, where the talent acquisition sort of job postings were relatively stable. There was modest growth, and we're starting to see that sort of hit in 2024. We started to see some big declines, and we're starting to see that sort of there's a lot of more volatility. And I think part of that is
Yes.
just because the EU isn't sort of as monolithic. Every geography operates a little bit differently, but you're starting to see some changes in the EU. And maybe there's also a lagging factor where the EU sort of has always been, maybe has had from an economic standpoint, a few quarters behind sort of US trends. So as we sort of just want to recap some of the themes before we talk about actionable tips. US continues to be a very tight labor market, especially in frontline go-to-market roles, and tech roles are starting to see softening, but I think we're going to start to see a bounce back. We're starting to see some softness in the labor market permeate into Europe. But there's still geographies like Germany that are incredibly hard to hire in and incredibly difficult to sort of get. And we're starting to see Eastern European markets increasingly get hotter as companies are allocating and building hubs there to take advantage of sort of the talent markets. The impact on return to office is massive. The delta between on-site, hybrid, and remote is incredible. And we're starting to see TA hiring in the US bounce back, even though it might be easing up in Europe. So now, if you're a talent acquisition leader, a talent acquisition professional, how do you react to this? How do you plan for this? And we have 4 actionable tips on grappling with sort of this confusing talent market. Tip number 1, the pass-through rate tells a story. If you're the definition of a pass-through rate is the number of people that you hire divided by the total number of applications you get. Now, there's 2 angles to the pass-through rate. The first is absolute. Is it abundant or scarce? So if your pass-through rate is less than 0.4%, you're getting 250 apps per hire. You're just dealing with unmanageable abundance. Versus, in some parts, you've got scarcity where you've got a pass rate of more than 2%. This is a number I would look at every month. I would have up on my dashboards. It's so important because this single number tells you what's happening in your market. And many of you, if you're in a large organization, you don't operate in one labor market or one economy. Some of your areas, some departments, some business units, some geos, some types of jobs are in acute scarcity. Some might be in unmanageable abundance. And you've got to sort of treat them differently and segment them differently. But the second aspect of that is how it's changing quarter over quarter is critical, because this is what's going to impact your time to fill. It's going to impact your quality. It's going to impact your capacity planning. So what is the magnitude of the change? What is the direction of the change? Really driving that and impacting that. If you're a data people customer, we have a pass-through report, and it tells you sort of what the pass-through rate is or your overall versus your benchmark, but also how many applications you need to make a hire. This is whether you use data people or you're just using a BI solution, using your ATS, drilling it into remote versus on-site and different geographies is critical. I think I want to pause and just answer one of the questions on the chat. I see one from Bro that says, how is AI impacting job availability? We're seeing some interesting trends where there are more generative AI jobs, especially in certain verticals. However, I don't think AI has really and meaningfully impacted job availability across the board in any significant way. What AI is doing is impacting applicant volumes in a significant way. It's making it easier for our candidates to apply to jobs. And so it's requiring sort of more steps on the employer side to deal with it. But we haven't seen a significant uptick in AI job volumes or in AI posting jobs in a meaningful way. I want to talk about tip number 2. One of the things is we're operating in such a confusing labor market that it might be easy to attribute what's happening, another change to a labor market when it's not coming from the labor market. And a really good example of that is LinkedIn and Indeed have both made such massive changes in their algorithms in the last year. So oftentimes when we're looking at somebody's data, we're looking at a company's data, it may appear, oh my gosh, we're getting a huge amount of volume because candidates are filling it up, or we're getting no volume because the labor market's really tight. And that might not be true. It might be a result of subtle changes in syndication strategy. Let me give you some examples of that. LinkedIn rolled out, for example, its hashtags, LinkedIn on-site, hybrid, remote, as a method to surfacing up roles. That's had a significant impact on search. You've also seen pay transparency have a significant impact on search. So if you accidentally miss pay transparency ranges in jobs that require them or don't have the right format, Indeed can either remove your jobs from the search or downplay the jobs in your search. And so what's happening is, and then you're also having a lot more syndication to different job boards. And sometimes, your jobs get picked up in a newsletter, gets picked up in sort of a blog, and volumes explode. So really drilling into syndication changes rather than just attributing it to a market change. And one of the ways to do that is through the inbound source report. And I like to look at 2 things there. I like to look at both the absolute volumes. Are you still getting the same volume from LinkedIn, from Indeed, from your major sources that you used to? And are you getting the same application to screening pass-through rates? Because if you should be trying to aim for north of 5% of applied candidates making it to your phone screen. If that's going down or going up significantly, those are both areas of concern. Even if the quality is getting a lot better, that just might mean that you're having a starvation problem. So don't just get excited, really think about that. We actually did a workshop a few weeks ago on job board optimization. How do you optimize your hiring for LinkedIn and for Indeed and for other job boards? That could be really helpful as you sort of try to get ahead of their algorithms, try to get the right quality and avoid sort of some of the signal to noise problems that a lot of companies are dealing with in this market right now. Tip number 3, check if outbound is still effective and needed. One of the things that's happened is we have a huge capability shift. In fact, one of the things we saw in our data was that the number of sourcing jobs relative to generalist TA jobs has cut in half in the last couple of years. And that's not a surprise. I guess TA is kind of taken forward, inbound is coming through, it makes sense to move away from sourcing. The problem is, sourcing was one of the ways where companies achieve burst capacity. If your inbound pool stops working as effectively and you have only a generalist recruiting team, suddenly that burst capacity is not the same effectiveness as it was when it was a dedicated sourcing team. And so this is something that's really important to think about is your outbound still as efficacious? And is it sort of built in the right way? And the second piece is AI overload. One of the things that we're seeing that's happening is as companies are using more AI-driven messaging, even if you're not using AI-driven messaging, it's possible your competitors are, recruiting and search firms are, they are flooding the market with in-mails, and candidates are getting flooded with in-mails. And what it's resulting in is, up to 2/3 decreases in response rates, in qualified response rates. So it's starting to make sourcing much harder, even at a time where you think, and this can be really counterintuitive. Your hiring managers, your business leaders are like, hey, the market's supposed to be getting softer, it's supposed to be getting easier to hire. And actually the exact opposite is happening. It's getting harder to hire because you're getting poor applicant volume, getting poor response rates. It's sort of harder to instrument. So it's really important to see if this is still happening. And one of the ways we like to we have an outbound report if you're a Data People customer where you can look at that. And what I like to look at that is look at it by recruiter and look at it by different sources and figure out what your capacity baselines are. So how many candidates are individual sources and recruiters are able to bring through? And then you can start to build a capacity model. One of the problems is we're still relying often on capacity models that were built 2 years ago. And as the markets change, those capacity models don't work anymore. And Robert makes a really interesting comment that we're going to read out. Since LinkedIn and Indeed strongly monopolize search volumes, do you predict that a particular market will utilize more local board sites and TA should get access to these? I actually don't. I've as we've been analyzing, if anything that's happened in the last couple of years is that the efficacy of LinkedIn and Indeed has increased more dramatically relative to local job boards and smaller niche job boards. And so it's become a lot harder to get ROI from niche job boards. And I would argue that as the markets have started to get, especially in some areas like go-to-market, have gotten easier, it's just a lot easier to build a better LinkedIn or Indeed strategy than it is to try to go into lots of different job boards and try to optimize. The risk isn't that. I think many of those job boards will probably get you candidates. The risk is, are you going to get really good signal to noise that can kind of manage it up? The caveat that I'll give you there, though, is if you're in very, very niche sectors, let's say you're manufacturing in a very specific geo, or if you're looking for actuarial jobs, which are really hard to find great actuarial talent, those are where some of the niche job boards can be somewhat effective, but you have to use them very strategically. Finally, I want to talk about capacity models, especially for the recruiting leaders we're on, because the labor landscape is different. In the past, one of the ways we do capacity models was as a full monolith. So you'd say, okay, a typical rec load for a recruiter should be 3 to 6 recs per quarter in professional roles, maybe 10 to 15, 20 in high volume hiring roles. There's a few problems with that. The first is remote and on-site has completely changed this. So you cannot build a single capacity model. And I find often recruiters are often working remote or hybrid and on-site jobs at the same time. That is hard. It's completely different motions in some senses. The second thing that's really important is time to hire is key. Most companies use time to fill as a critical metric. And it should be. It's your North Star metric. But the time to fill is a lagging metric. Time to fill only you see it when your recs close. Most of the time, your recs often have multiple hires. And time to hire can be a leading metric. It can give you a sense of where time to fill is going to go. And so it gives you a sense of where your capacity models are going. And I want to give you a simple example. Let's say we have just an illustrative, a recruiter can handle 5 recs at a time, and each takes 2 months. And let's say 1 out of 3 jobs take 1 month longer. What that is just 13% increase in time. What it effectively does is now a recruiter in 6 months can hire 30% less. A 13% delay, what seems like a small delay, results in a third of your recruiting capacity evaporating. That is the big problem. And this is what's happening all across talent acquisition because we've already cut TA capacity. You have no slack and you get a small 10% delay, and suddenly we don't hit our hiring goals, or we end up spending on very expensive sourcing or very expensive recruiting, and we've gotten rid of a lot of the burst capacity. So this is where the number one metric that I would argue that we've got to be focused on is time to hire. It's the leading metric. It's the thing that's going to tell us about capacity, and I'd sort of really focus on that. So those were my 4 tips. My tip number 5, a simple bonus tip, is if you can, be really, really clear about the location requirements of a job. If your job is hybrid, spell out what that means. If your job is remote, be extremely, use the LinkedIn tags, because the performance is so variable as we're seeing. The more explicit, the more specificity you provide candidates, the better quality candidates, the more diversity of the funnel, the whole funnel looks better and you get better performance out of the major search engines. So those are our 5 tips. Kelsey, what else? What else is on your mind? How else can our customers think about this?
Yeah, I think kind of an overlay on theme for both sides, both from the data perspective and the tips, is just be really intentional and mindful about the cross sections that you're looking at and come with a strategic approach that makes sense for that segment that you're trying to target. We're not in a one size fits all place right now. I don't know if we're ever going back to that place based off of how jobs have evolved, but having a specified plan that really focuses on that intention behind your goal and being specific about those things.
I love it. Let's summarize just the handful of takeaways. The first is, are you in a position of candidate abundance or candidate scarcity? Let's identify that before you build a capacity model. Number 2, is outbound actually helping your performance? Really drill down into it, because we might have to change the motions in the world that we're operating today. The third is we need to really know, are you dealing with a market shift or a job board algorithm shift? Because too often the job board algorithm shift might be impacting you more than the market today. And finally, do you have the right TA capacity and do you have enough slack in the system? Because one of the worst things you could do is get stuck with slack and not have, get stuck with a slight delay and end up having to then overspend or overexert or miss key KPIs because the market shifts on you somewhere in 2025. And I suspect the market will. And so the capacity planning is more critical than ever. Those are some of our tips. I hope you found this really helpful. We've got a whole list of resources available for you on our website in different places, and we can share it with you. We're just really excited to have you on, and hopefully we can all build towards an incredible, efficient, and data-driven 2025. Kelsey, thank you for joining me today.
Thank you for having me.
You've been a wonderful audience. Thanks for all your great questions and thoughts and comments. Our next webinar and workshop is on February 12th on data-driven hiring. Hope to see you then. Thanks, everyone.